Joining me now with reaction to the president's address from the Oval Office, Florida Senator and Republican presidential candidate Marco Rubio. He's in Miami tonight. Senator, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Your thoughts on this address from the president about ISIS, the threats, and how they're evolving?
Well, let's begin by understanding the mood of the country. People are really scared and worried. You know, last night I ran into a couple that often travels abroad or to other parts of the country for New Year's Eve for the first time in over a decade. They're not traveling anywhere this year because they're so scared. Ran into someone else today who says they're avoiding stadiums and malls during the holiday season because they're scared. And people are scared not just because of these attacks, but because of a growing sense that we have a president that's completely overwhelmed by them. I mean, this is a president that called them the JV when they first emerged, ISIS did. Then just on the eve of the Paris attacks basically argued that they were being contained, called the attacks in Paris a setback as opposed to a widespread terrorist attack that showed real progress on behalf of ISIS. After Paris, by the way, the only emotion the president ever showed on his overseas trips is when he was attacking the GOP on the debates we were having here about what to do with the Syrian refugee program. And nothing that happened in this speech tonight is going to assuage people's fears. First of all, we heard tonight that the same strategy that has brought us to this point is the strategy he is going to continue with. I mean, he honestly believes that there is a coalition fighting against ISIS. This is absurd. There is no such coalition. A lot of countries that have put their names onto a piece of paper, but the reality of it is we continue to conduct very limited air assaults, and you can't just defeat them from an air perspective. And we can talk about that more in this interview, I suppose. Yeah. But if you look beyond that tonight, he announced nothing new other than we need gun control, even though it would have done nothing to prevent the attack in California. We need to prevent people on the no-fly list from buying these weapons, even though there are people that work for DHS that are on the no-fly list. And by the way, these individuals that conducted this attack would not have been prevented from accessing their weapons. And then the cynicism tonight to spend a significant amount of time talking about discrimination against Muslims. Where is there widespread evidence that we have a problem in America with discrimination against Muslims? And the refusal to call this for what it is, a war on radical Islam. So I'm very disappointed tonight. I think not only did the president not to make things better tonight, I fear he may have made things worse in the minds of many Americans.
Senator, the president finished his address by saying that freedom is more powerful than fear. And specifically, what would a President Rubio do differently than what President Obama is doing and laid out tonight?
Well, first, we would be straightforward and honest with the American people. ISIS is a growing, significant, and very serious threat. They are not contained. They are growing ever more present in multiple places. They now have a very substantial presence, not just in Iraq and in Syria. They now have a very substantial presence in Libya, a growing presence in Afghanistan. They are actively plotting, and you'll see them over the next few months, attempt attacks in places like Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan. They'll target American troops in places like Turkey. They are actively trying to use the refugee crisis to infiltrate fighters into Europe, into Canada, here into the homeland. They are a very real threat. We are at war with a radical jihadist group more capable than any terrorist group and any armed insurgency this nation has ever confronted. We can defeat them if we employ the power of the United States in a true coalition with others around the world. We can defeat this group, but it will take a combination of things. It will take a substantial ground force, to which the primary bulk of it must be made up of local Sunni Arabs, but there will be the necessity to significantly increase the number of U.S. special operators embedded alongside them.
Do you have a number?
Well, I think that's why you ask military officers to design a strategy, a plan, and those plans and those tactics are going to drive the number of people you need to implement it, whatever number it takes. By the way, the president tonight talked cynically, again, as is normally the case with him, about we're not going to have an Iraq-style war again. No one is calling for an invasion of 100,000 American troops. We don't need 100,000 troops from anywhere to defeat ISIS, but it will take a substantial ground army that needs to be made up primarily of Sunni Arabs from the region, but they will need American special operators, a significant increase in air support, and we will have to beef up our intelligence programs. I wish the president tonight would have been honest with the American people. In order to prevent and disrupt these attacks in the future, we are going to need to be able to gather more intelligence, not less intelligence. And as president, he has supported measures and in fact implemented measures that have weakened our intelligence gathering capability. We do these things, we will defeat them. It will not be easy, it will take time, but we will defeat them. But it starts by acknowledging to the American people that indeed we are at war, and we are at war with radical Islamic jihadists who are also terrorists, of course, but motivated by their view of Islam. This is a war on radical Islam.
Senator, obviously the president did talk about the terrorist threat evolving, and as we saw in San Bernardino, there may be more incidents where terrorists are inspired but not directed, and we don't know all the details yet, obviously. We asked people to write in on social media. Karen on Twitter wrote in a question for you. What is radicalization, and how would you fight it within America?
Well, radicalization is the notion that an individual doesn't just convert to Islam or becomes active in Islamic faith, but actually becomes active in an interpretation of the Islamic faith that calls on jihad. And in the case of ISIS, it's about the belief that they are an army that's going to trigger an apocalyptic showdown with the West. That's why they have a publication monthly called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. It is a city in Syria that they believe will be the site of a final armed confrontation. These people that are becoming radicalized are being inspired to join the army that's going to win that fight and usher in a global caliphate. And by the way, the threat of a homegrown violent extremist is the most significant and dangerous development in this entire war on terror, because they become undetectable. In essence, you're talking about individuals that were on no database. No one had any reason to be concerned about them, apparently, until the day of this attack. And these are very difficult plots to disrupt. Sometimes they involve family relationships, as in the case of the Boston Marathon, obviously in the case of the attack in California. We need better intelligence gathering capabilities to try to disrupt them, and more importantly, in this particular case, what I'm most interested in is whether they get $30,000 to $40,000, which is what it would have cost at least to assemble the arsenal that they did for the pipe bombs, and because based on what he earned working as a health inspector, there's no way he paid for this. So they may have been inspired, but someone funded this, and this is a critical development we need to know more about.
Senator, you were completely dismissive of the president's talk about preventing someone on a no-fly list from getting a gun. Obviously, the New York Times, in kind of an unusual move since really the 1920s, put a New York Times editorial on the front page saying recently, it is a moral outrage and a national disgrace that civilians can legally purchase weapons designed specifically to kill people with brutal speed and efficiency. America's elected leaders offer prayers for gun victims and then callously and without fear of consequence reject the most basic restrictions on weapons of mass killing, as they did on Thursday. They distract us with arguments about the word terrorism. The New York Times continuing, let's be clear, these spree killings are all, in their own ways, acts of terrorism. Your reaction to that?
Well, certainly they're all horrible tragedies, but there's a difference between that. Not that one is worse or better than the other, but in the case of radical Islam, we are battling a ideology that goes much deeper than just a grievance someone has or some domestic issue that may happen or mental illness. In the case of some of these horrible tragedies, these are people that know exactly what they are doing, and they're being motivated by their interpretation of their faith that calls for global jihad, the defeat of all in this case of ISIS, all non-Sunni radicals, and the establishment of a global caliphate. That is what is motivating them to take these attacks. In the case of the no-fly list, the no-fly list is populated with a substantial number of Americans that are nothing close to being terrorists. They're on that list by mistake because they share a name with someone else. And the notion that a radical jihadist who is on the no-fly list is going to walk into a local gun shop to purchase a gun is absurd. And that's not how they're going to purchase weapons or any of the elements they need for a pipe bomb, for that matter. This is nothing but an effort to use this issue of terrorism as another way to try to push their agenda that they've been dying to push for the longest amount of time, and that's gun control.
To the 2016 race and your race for the Republican primary nomination, you have been on the attack against several of your opponents, including Senator Ted Cruz, about their vote against the metadata program, the NSA program. Today on Meet the Press, Senator Rand Paul, also on the other side of that issue, said this about you.
You know, if Senator Rubio were doing his job and in Congress more, he might know that the program continues. It's been ongoing for the last 6 months. So the Paris tragedy, this tragedy, happened while we were still doing bulk collection, all bulk collection. Also in France, they have a program 1,000-fold more invasive, collecting all of the data of all the French, and yet they still weren't able to see this coming.
How do you answer Senator Paul?
Well, first, there was an era here in this country 2 to 3 years ago where, because of the disclosures of a traitor like Edward Snowden and other things out in the media, misrepresentations by elected officials, including some in the Senate, some came to believe that they were being spied on by the government. If someone in our intelligence community is unlawfully accessing the private information of any American, they should be fired and they should be prosecuted. But the bottom line is that both through executive order, presidential directives, and this USA Patriot Act that passed earlier this year, we have taken out an important component of this plan. Here's the reality of the metadata collection. There are a large and significant number of companies that have already said, we are either not going to collect records at all, we're not going to have any records if you come asking for them, or we're only going to keep them on average of 18 months. And so when the intelligence community or law enforcement comes knocking and subpoenas those records, in many cases there won't be any records, because some of these companies already said they're not going to hold these records. And the result is that we will not be able in many cases to put together the full puzzle, the full picture of some of these individuals. In the case of these individuals that conducted this attack, we cannot see any phone records for the first 3 years in which he was. You can only see him up to 2 years to 3 years. You will not be able to see the full 5-year picture. Maybe it provides some information, maybe it doesn't. But we need every tool at our disposal. We are fighting an enemy here in radical Islam and in homegrown violent extremists unlike anything this nation has ever faced. This is not a time for ideological silliness. This is a time for serious action, because the future security of our country is at stake.
But quickly, Senator, in a GOP primary electorate that appears very skeptical of the government overall, do you think this is a winning issue for you?
I think it's the right position to take for the future of our country. It's the most important obligation of our federal government, is to provide for our national security. And I will continue to support anything that provides for our national security, and I believe we can provide for it without violating the civil liberties of Americans. But we are going to need programs like this in order to identify people before they can attack us, to identify cells and break them up before they can conduct attacks. Even with the existence of these programs, these homegrown violent extremists have been able to carry out attacks. Imagine without them. I know this: if God forbid there's an attack tomorrow morning in another major U.S. city, the first question everyone's going to have is, why didn't we know about them and how come we didn't stop it? And the answer better not be because a tool we once had that could have allowed us to identify them is no longer available to us. And there are members of my party that, through their votes and by siding with isolationists and people who hold on to these theories that are false, have put potentially our nation in a position where we can't gather this information any longer.
Well, Senator Rubio, thanks for the time tonight away from your family. Reaction to the president's speech, we appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad.
Let's bring back our panel. Reaction to Senator Rubio and final thoughts on the speech. AB.
Well, I think Senator Rubio's comments really highlighted the opportunities that President Obama missed tonight. Senator Rubio acknowledged far more how fearful Americans are than the confidence he has about prevailing and being on the right side of history. He acknowledged people's fears, and that's important. The second thing is he talked specifically about intelligence gathering and data, the hindrances we have to encrypted data. People want to be told specifics about what the challenges are and how we're going to get around them. President Obama said, the Muslim community has to face this, straight on without excuse, but he didn't, he spent far more time talking about not discriminating against them. It's time for them to stand up and help us find people in their families who actually betrayed no signs or evidence that they were stockpiling bombs. It was just a totally different message from Senator Rubio.
Charles.
Rubio gave the presidential speech. He gave a plan that is a lot more plausible than Obama's, continue what we're doing. And I think his emphasis was exactly right. I think Obama's a man who came into office and abolished the term global war on terror. He gave a speech a couple of years ago at the War College saying we cannot continue this war because of the damage it's doing to the fabric of America, as if he could unilaterally end a war. Well, obviously he can't. Obviously the other guys are still at war, and the global war on terror came home to America with a vengeance. And this week in San Bernardino, and the president was not prepared to deal with it.
Juan.
Senator Rubio looks strong. I thought, he comes across as if someone who really, I think, is speaking to the Republican electorate effectively. Now, let me just quickly say, obviously, we've seen in the recent days Donald Trump's numbers go up. In the most recent poll, he's in the mid-30s My goodness. So he is stepping away from the field at this moment of anxiety. Rubio is locked in a feud with Senator Cruz. I think that's why he's talking about intelligence gathering techniques, Patriot Act versus Freedom Act. And you played the little soundbite from Senator Paul in which he said Rubio's been absent. So you can see the kind of infighting going on there. When it came to specifics, however, I didn't hear anything from him. He called for more special ops, more air support, more intelligence. Anything very different than what the president has been prescribing.
Well, no-fly zone's different.
Well, no, but this no-fly zone here, again, would require troops on the ground. And that's where the big thing is. When you said, how many troops on the ground, Senator, he said, oh, whatever it takes. But then he said, we're not calling for 10,000 or 100,000. So that was a non-answer in my book.
But there will be the necessity to significantly increase the number of U.S. special operators embedded alongside them.
Do you have a number?
Well, I think that's why you ask military officers to design a strategy, a plan, and those plans and those tactics are going to drive the number of people you need to implement it, whatever number it takes.
Okay.
He called for a substantial ground army, and he would call them troops, unlike the president, who has 3,500 Americans serving over there now and refuses to call them boots on the ground. I think Senator Rubio made clear that he would at least take that obligation seriously. Look, the big question coming into tonight was whether President Obama would change his strategy. We've had the same strategy for 7 years. It's failed. He said that the threat is evolving. He's right that it's evolving. It's growing. And you would expect to hear from the commander-in-chief that there would be some recognition of that fact and that he has some plan to combat that. He didn't have that. In 2012, his current CIA director said that we may be done with the threat of al-Qaeda by the end of this decade. He was wrong then. The president is wrong today.
Obama showed up. He was AWOL on this, so that I think is a plus for him. Everything else I thought was lacking. No strategy and no passion on this.
Well, thank you for inviting us into your home tonight.